Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad of your company for one more visit to Baker Street. Tell me, when you sign your name, or seal a letter, do you ever pause to wonder what such small marks might reveal to a careful eye? Watson learned that even a vanished scratch upon silver could undo a very patient lie. Do subscribe so no detail escapes you, and find us always on Watson's Margins on Spotify, the link waiting below. Now settle in, for as Holmes maintained, it is the little things that are infinitely the most important. Chapter 1. A Visitor from the Old Bailey. It was upon a raw and fog-laden evening in November that I found Sherlock Holmes engaged in one of those curious domestic experiments which so often heralded, though I did not know it at the time, some singular case soon to fall within our door. He was seated at the deal table by the window, a stick of red sealing wax in one hand and a candle burning close beside him, while before him lay a scattering of cloth samples of varying texture and weave. "You will observe, Watson," said he, without lifting his eyes from his work, "that soot deposits itself differently according to the nap of the cloth beneath it. A coarse weave retains the finer particles, a smooth one permits them to fall away. It is a distinction I have long suspected, and one which may yet prove of value." I confess that I regarded this pursuit with the mild indulgence of an old campaigner, accustomed to his friend's methods, and settled myself by the fire with the evening paper, in which I had been reading an account of the trial then proceeding at the Old Bailey, the Crown's prosecution of one Edmund Vane, upon a charge of stealing confidential naval plans from the Admiralty. It was accounted one of the most sensational matters to come before the courts that year, and I remarked upon it to Holmes, who replied only with a grunt of professional disinterest, being at that time wholly absorbed in the properties of candle grease. We had not sat thus above half an hour when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a Mr. Percival Harcourt, who entered with the hurried, apologetic air of a man uncertain of his welcome. He was young, dark-haired, and possessed of that pallor which comes not from illness but from sleepless nights spent over briefs and papers. His collar, though clean, was not quite straight, and his hands, as he seated himself, betrayed a slight and persistent tremor. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I have come to you upon a matter which I fear will strike you as trivial, and which has already been dismissed as such by wiser heads than mine. Yet I cannot rest until I have laid it before you." "Pray do so," said Holmes, setting aside his wax with evident reluctance, though I observed that his eyes had already begun that swift assessing survey of our visitor's person, which I had come to recognise as the true beginning of his interest. "You are, I think, a junior member of the bar, attached in some capacity to the Crown prosecution presently sitting at the Old Bailey." Harcourt started. "How could you know that, sir?" "The ink stain upon your right cuff is fresh, and of the particular blue-black favoured by the Crown Office. The crease across your waistcoat pocket suggests the habitual carrying of a brief bag rather than a private practice. And you have, if I am not mistaken, been on your feet in court within the last 4 hours, for the dust of the corridors there has a character all its own, and clings yet to the toe of your left boot." "You're quite right in every particular," said our visitor with something like awe. "I am assisting Sir Matthew Corvin in the prosecution of Edmund Vane, the case of which Dr. Watson was but now reading. You will know, perhaps, that the whole of the Crown's case rests upon a single article, Exhibit 17, a silver cigarette case taken from Vane's rooms, within the lining of which was discovered a strip of tracing paper bearing a portion of the stolen naval plans." "I recall the particulars," said Holmes. "The exhibit has been kept since its recovery under seal in the evidence cabinet of the court. A cabinet, I should explain, which cannot be opened save by the concurrence of 3 keys, held severally by the evidence clerk, the presiding court officer, and Inspector Lestrade, who himself effected the original recovery. It is by every account as secure a repository as exists in England." "And yet you are troubled," said Holmes quietly. Harcourt hesitated, twisting his hands together. "Mr. Holmes, some days before the trial opened, I was permitted a private inspection of the exhibit, in order to prepare my notes upon it. I examined the case closely, I had cause to, for a small dent near the hinge, shallow but quite distinct, had been remarked upon in the original police inventory. When I inspected the case again only yesterday in open session, that dent was gone. You're certain of this? As certain as a man may be who has stared at a single object for the better part of an hour with a barrister's anxious thoroughness. But when I mentioned the matter to Sir Matthew, he assured me that my memory had deceived me, and Inspector Lestrade was, I confess, rather short with me upon the subject. No one else considers the difference of the least importance. The world is full of things of no importance, said Holmes, until they are found to be the hinge upon which everything turns. Tell me, Mr. Harcourt, who has had occasion to handle or to guard this exhibit since its recovery. Harcourt drew a small notebook from his coat. There is Sir Matthew Corven himself, whose reputation as Crown Prosecutor stands or falls upon this conviction. There is Inspector Lestrade, who found the case. There is Mr. Arthur Bell, a solicitor of considerable polish who defends Vane, and who is not a man, I think, to scruple over methods. There is Miss Eleanor Vane, the accused's sister, who has been devoted in her attendance throughout. There is old Mr. Abel Pritchard, a courtroom usher of 30 years' unblemished service, and there is Mr. Josiah Pell, the evidence clerk, who is responsible for the registering and safekeeping of all Crown exhibits. And this Mr. Pell, what manner of man is he? The most helpful of them all, Mr. Holmes. It was he who discovered an error in the original evidence room entry, and corrected it without being asked. He who remained late upon his own initiative to see the cabinet properly sealed. If I had to name the one person above suspicion in this entire affair, it would be Josiah Pell. Something passed across Holmes's face at this, so fleeting that I might have imagined it, had I not known him so well. He rose and stood a moment before the fire, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin. "It has been my experience, Mr. Harcourt," said he at length, "that the men we trust most completely are precisely those whom we have ceased to observe. Trust is a comfortable garment, but it is no substitute for the evidence of one's own eyes. You did well to come to me. I shall want to see this cabinet and this exhibit before another day has passed, and I should be glad if it could be arranged before the court is filled with spectators and lawyers to confuse the ground with their comings and goings." "Before dawn, if you wish it," said Harcourt eagerly. "I can obtain admittance." "Before dawn, then," said Holmes, and I saw in his eye that particular light, half eagerness and half austerity, which told me that, whatever trifle had brought Mr. Percival Harcourt to our door, my friend did not believe it to be a trifle at all. Chapter 2. The Cabinet with 3 Keys. The fog had not lifted when we set out the following morning, but had rather thickened into a yellow murk that pressed against the cab windows and turned the gas lamps of the embankment into pale swimming moons. Harcourt was waiting for us beneath the great portico of the Old Bailey, muffled to the chin, his breath showing white even within the shelter of the stone arch. "They will not thank us for this hour," he said, as he led the way within, "but I have arranged it with the night superintendent, who owes me a small favour, and who will ask no questions provided we are gone before the ordinary business of the court begins." The corridors within were dim and echoing, lit at intervals by single gas jets turned low, and possessed of that peculiar chill which seems to belong to buildings given over to solemn purpose. Our footsteps rang upon the stone with a hollowness that made conversation seem almost an intrusion. Holmes said nothing as we went, but I observed that his eyes moved continually over walls, floor and ceiling, as though he were memorizing the very geography of the place. We came at length to the evidence room, a narrow chamber lined with numbered cabinets of dark oak, each fronted with a small brass plate and a stout lock. Before the cabinet marked with the number of the Vane case there already stood 3 men, Inspector Lestrade, looking as though he had been roused from his bed with poor grace, a stout silver-whiskered court officer whom I did not know, and a slight grey figure who bent forward to unlock the topmost bolt with the neat, unhurried precision of a man performing a familiar office. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with the air of one determined to be civil despite provocation, I hope you have not been dragged from your bed on Mr. Harcourt's account. I have told him 12 times that he has confused this case with one of 100 others just like it. A man who spends his days staring at silver cigarette cases is bound to see dents where none exist. Possibly, said Holmes mildly, yet I've generally found it cheaper to look than to assume, Lestrade, and we are here now. The grey clerk, for this I understood was Mr. Josiah Pell, completed the unlocking of the cabinet with a small deferential bow and stood aside. The seals are quite unbroken, gentlemen, as you may see for yourselves, said he, in a voice so soft and even that one had almost to lean forward to catch it. I examined them not an hour past before your arrival, out of an abundance of caution. Holmes bent above the wax seals without touching them, studying each in turn through his lens. You're a careful man, Mr. Pell. I endeavour to be, sir. The integrity of the Crown's evidence is a trust I do not take lightly. The cabinet swung open, and there, upon a square of dark velvet, lay the cigarette case, a handsome object of chased silver, monogrammed and closed. Holmes did not lift it at once, but knelt before the open cabinet and studied it for some moments, with his hands clasped behind him, in the attitude of a man examining a picture in a gallery, rather than an article of evidence. You will observe, said he at last, addressing no one in particular, that the cloth beneath the case shows two outlines, one considerably darker than the other, as though the article had lain in one position for a great while, and had then been shifted to a second. Pell inclined his head. That is easily explained, Mr. Holmes. The case was moved during a general inventory some weeks past, when the whole of the evidence room was rearranged according to the new numbering system. I have the register here, if you wish to see it. He produced from within his coat a small ledger, and turned with practised speed to an entry recording the transfer, dated and initialled in a neat small hand. Most thorough, said Holmes, examining the entry with what I took to be genuine admiration, though I knew him too well to be entirely certain. He handed the ledger back with a slight bow of his own, and I confess that I too found myself impressed by the clerk's quiet exactitude. There was nothing in his manner but the modest pride of a man devoted to unglamorous duty. Holmes now lifted the case itself, turning it beneath the gas jet, and I saw his lean fingers travel over the hinge, the tarnished silver about the monogram, and the small screws that secured the inner plate, with the delicate, searching touch of a physician examining a wound. He paused longest upon the hinge. There is a pale crescent of grease upon the floor of the cabinet just beneath the left corner, he observed presently, and here, caught upon the lower hinge of the cabinet door itself, a single thread of green wool. The ushers wear green, said Harcourt quickly, glancing toward the door as though half expecting to see old Pritchard standing there. So they do, said Holmes, and said no more upon the subject, though I marked that he drew a small envelope from his pocket and with the point of his knife transferred the thread into it with as much care as though it had been a jewel. He turned next to Pell. One question more, if you will indulge an idle curiosity. The labels affixed to the Crown exhibits. Are they inscribed with iron gall ink, or with the copying ink commonly used for duplicate registers? The clerk blinked, and for the first time in our interview a faint line of puzzlement crossed his mild countenance. Iron gall, Mr. Holmes? Always. It is the more durable, and does not fade under the office gas lamps. I confess I do not follow the purpose of the question. No more do I as yet, said Holmes pleasantly, and turned away, leaving the clerk to stare after him with an expression that hovered, I thought, between bewilderment and something else less easily named. We took our leave shortly after, Lestrade grumbling about wasted mornings, and Harcourt anxious and unsatisfied. It was not until we stood once more beneath the fog-shrouded portico that Holmes spoke again upon the matter. Watson, said he, drawing his coat about him against the chill, I begin to suspect that the cabinet we have just examined, with all its bolts and seals and its 3 several keys, may never have been opened at all. Not at least in the sense that Mr. Harcourt supposes. I laughed, thinking he jested, My dear fellow, we have just watched it opened before our own eyes. Holmes did not smile. So we have, said he, and fell into a silence which lasted the whole length of our journey home. Chapter 3. The exhibit changes in open court. The courtroom, when we entered it that morning, presented a very different aspect from the cold and echoing chamber of some hours before. Every bench was filled, and a low murmur of anticipation ran through the crowd like wind through a field of corn, for the case of the Crown against Edmund Vane had by now become the talk of the clubs and the newspapers alike, and there was scarce a person in London with any pretension to fashion who had not contrived some excuse to be present. Holmes and I found places at the rear, from which vantage we could observe the whole proceeding without ourselves attracting notice, a discretion which Holmes evidently prized, for he had exchanged his usual attire for a plainer suit, and sat with his hat drawn somewhat low. Sir Matthew Corvin, a large, florid man whose voice filled the chamber without apparent effort, opened the day's business with an address of such confident severity that I saw more than one juror nod in unconscious agreement. "Gentlemen of the jury," he declared, "you have heard how the prisoner's guilt rests upon no mere chain of circumstance, but upon an object which he carried upon his own person, an object which I shall now place before you, that you may judge with your own eyes the damning nature of the evidence it contains." At his signal, the silver cigarette case was brought forward upon a small tray by the clerk of the court, and Sir Matthew, with the air of a man about to deliver the final and fatal stroke of his argument, took it up and pressed open the catch. What followed, I shall not soon forget. Sir Matthew's confident expression froze, then crumbled into something like bewilderment. He turned the case this way and that, thrust his finger beneath the velvet lining, and finally held it aloft with a hand that visibly trembled. "There is nothing here," said he, in a voice quite altered from the one with which he had begun. "The tracing paper, it is gone." The courtroom erupted. I have witnessed disorder in public assemblies before, but seldom have I seen so respectable a gathering dissolve so swiftly into confusion. Ushers called for silence. The judge's gavel fell again and again without visible effect, and above the general clamour I heard Arthur Bell's voice, sharp and triumphant, demanding that the prosecution explain how evidence sealed under the authority of the Crown could vanish from within a locked cabinet. Worse was to follow. An expert witness, a jeweller of some repute who had been called to testify upon the construction of the case, was permitted to examine it upon the spot, and declared, after a brief inspection, that the velvet lining bore no crease, no discoloration, no trace whatsoever to suggest that any paper had ever been concealed beneath it. It was, he said, as smooth and unmarked as the day it left the silversmith's hands. "Then it is not the same case," cried Edmund Vane from the dock, starting to his feet before his jailers could restrain him. His face, pale already from months of confinement, had gone the colour of ash. "I tell you that is not my cigarette case." Sir Matthew, recovering something of his composure, turned upon the defence with an accusation of his own, declaring in ringing tones that no hand but that of the prisoner's friends could have contrived so audacious a substitution, and hinting darkly at corruption within the very offices of justice. Arthur Bell returned the charge with interest, demanding an inquiry into how the Crown's own evidence-keepers had permitted so grave a breach, and the two men might have come to open quarrel had not the judge, at last regaining command of his court, ordered a recess. It was in the corridor without, amid the general confusion, that I found Lestrade, red-faced and grim, already constructing his theory of the matter. "It is plain enough," said he to Holmes, who had drawn near with that unhurried air he so often assumed at moments when other men grew hurried. "Someone has substituted an identical case for the genuine article. The question is only who, and I think we need not look far. That green thread you were so taken with yesterday, Mr. Holmes. The ushers wear green, do they not? And old Pritchard has the run of this courtroom at all hours." A search was ordered upon the instant, and within the hour word came that Pritchard's modest lodgings off the Borough had yielded a torn evidence label and a stick of red sealing wax of a composition matching that used by the court. The old usher, when confronted, protested his innocence with a vehemence that seemed to convince no one but himself, insisting that the articles had been placed among his belongings by some hand other than his own. He was taken into custody before the afternoon session resumed, a broken and bewildered figure whose 30 years of unblemished service seemed, in the space of a single morning, to have counted for nothing. Holmes obtained leave, through Harcourt's good offices, to examine the torn label before it was placed among the new evidence, and I watched him bend above it with his lens for a longer time than the object seemed to warrant. "You will notice, Watson," said he quietly, drawing me aside, "that the fibres of this paper have been disturbed from the printed side rather than the blank. A man tearing a label in haste to conceal or destroy it, tears without regard to which face bears the ink. This tear has been made with some deliberation, as though the printed word were of particular interest to whoever performed it. And the sealing wax bears upon its surface a fine deposit of soot, of a character produced only by a gas flame. Yet the evidence room, as we observed this very morning, is lit by candles alone." He returned the label to its envelope with exaggerated care. Trivial distinctions, Lestrade would tell us, and yet it is invariably the trivial distinction which the guilty man forgets to erase. I confess that I did not, at that hour, grasp the full weight of his meaning. My mind was yet occupied with the spectacle of poor Pritchard being led away, and with the ruin so suddenly descended upon a case that had, but a day before, seemed as solid as the stone walls that housed it. Holmes, however, wore the look I had come to know well, that of a man who saw, amid the wreckage others took for chaos, the first outlines of a pattern invisible to every eye but his own. Chapter 4. A Scratch upon Silver. We obtained admittance to the jail upon the following afternoon, Holmes having exerted such influence as he possessed with the authorities to secure a private interview with the prisoner. Edmund Vane received us in a bare stone cell, and I was struck at once by the change that some months of confinement had wrought upon a man who had been, by every account, one of the more promising officials of the Admiralty. His hands, though he strove to keep them still, betrayed the restlessness of a man whose fate hangs upon the word of others. "Mr. Holmes," said he, rising, "if you have come to ask whether the case is mine, I will spare you the trouble. It is, or was. I do not deny that the cigarette case found in my rooms was once my own property. What I deny, and shall go on denying though it cost me my life, is that it ever contained a scrap of naval paper, or that the case now shown in court is the same article at all." "You say it was stolen from you," said Holmes, seating himself upon the room's single stool without invitation. "Some days before the police search. I cannot say precisely how many, for I did not remark its absence at once, having several such cases and being careless of them. I noticed only that it was gone, and thought no more of the matter until it was produced against me as the instrument of my ruin, and the initials engraved upon the one shown in court. I have looked at them as closely as I am permitted, and I would swear before God that the engraving is not the work of the jeweller who supplied my own." Holmes questioned him closely upon this point, and upon several others besides, but it was not until we had taken our leave and proceeded to the modest house in Kensington, occupied by Miss Eleanor Vane, that the matter acquired the sharpness of a genuine clue. Miss Vane received us with the composed dignity of a woman who has schooled herself against despair, though I observed the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent upon her brother's behalf. When Holmes explained the purport of our visit, she answered without hesitation. "My brother's case bore a scratch, Mr. Holmes, a diagonal mark across the very centre of the monogram, made by my own clumsiness. We were at dinner, some 2 years since, and I let it fall upon the hearthstone while admiring the engraving. Edmund was vexed with me for a week, though he forgave me readily enough, as he forgives everyone everything. I have looked for that scratch upon the case shown in court, and it is not there. I said as much to Mr. Bell, who told me the observation was worthless without more. And yet, said Holmes, it is precisely the sort of observation that a court of law is apt to dismiss, and precisely the sort that a criminal is apt to overlook in his haste. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street that evening when Arthur Bell himself sought us out, accompanied by a thin, nervous individual whom he introduced as a servant from a hotel near the Strand. This man, prompted by Bell, related a curious tale that he had, upon several occasions during the preceding month, observed Mr. Pritchard, the usher, in conversation with a lady of striking appearance near the hotel entrance, and that he had no difficulty, upon being shown a photograph, in identifying the lady as Miss Eleanor Vane. "You will perceive the significance, Mr. Holmes," said Bell, with the smooth satisfaction of a man laying a winning card upon the table. "It suggests a very simple explanation for the whole affair, that Miss Vane, desperate to save her brother, bribed or persuaded the usher to effect the substitution." Lestrade, summoned to hear the servant's account, received it with undisguised delight, declaring that a conspiracy between the devoted sister and the sympathetic old usher explained a great deal that had puzzled him. When Miss Vane was confronted with the accusation, she did not deny the meetings, but insisted with quiet firmness that she had asked nothing of Pritchard beyond the delivery of a letter to her brother, a service he had performed, she said, out of simple kindness, and nothing more. Her reluctance to have the matter known, arising as it did from a natural delicacy, told against her now with a cruel irony, for her very secrecy was taken as proof of guilt. Holmes said little during this exchange, but I observed that his attention had fixed itself once more upon the false cigarette case, which Lestrade had reluctantly permitted him to examine under magnification in a quiet corner of the room. For the better part of an hour he bent above it with his lens, touching the hinge, the screws, the interior of the case, with the patient absorption of a naturalist over some rare specimen. "Watson," said he at length, beckoning me close, "observe this residue within the hinge, a fine white powder, such as is used in the polishing of silver, and here, beneath the head of this screw, minute grains of a blue pigment, of a shade I have encountered before only in the transfer papers used for naval charts. And here," he angled the case toward the lamp, "a faint depression in the metal, where a monogram once stood and has since been carefully filed away, and a second engraved above it." He turned next to the evidence label he had affixed to the case, comparing it with others Harcourt had procured for him. "The hand is Pell's, of that there can be no question. And yet observe how the ink has bled into the final two figures of the exhibit number, differently from its behaviour in the digits preceding. It is as though two inks, or two occasions, were here combined." That evening, once our visitors had departed, Holmes cleared the sitting-room table and set upon it my old tobacco box, 3 envelopes, and the small locked dispatch case in which he kept his more valuable papers. For above an hour he arranged and rearranged these objects in various sequences, murmuring to himself, consulting his watch, and beginning again whenever some detail failed to satisfy him. He offered no word of explanation, and I, knowing the futility of interruption at such times, retired to bed and left him still absorbed in his silent rehearsal, repeating some sequence of actions until, as I gathered from a triumphant exclamation that reached me upon the stair, he had succeeded in performing it without ever once opening the dispatch case at all. Chapter 5. The Men Behind the Evidence. Holmes determined, upon the following day, to interview each of the persons concerned in the affair separately, and I confess that I looked forward to this exercise with some curiosity, having long observed that my friend extracted from an hour's private conversation what a court of law might fail to discover in a week of public examination. We began with Sir Matthew Corvin, who received us in his chambers with the wary courtesy of a man who has been made to look foolish before the public, and does not relish the sensation. The florid confidence of the courtroom had given way to something more haggard. He sat behind a desk piled with briefs, and I noticed that his hand, when he poured himself a glass of water, was not entirely steady. "I will be plain with you, Mr. Holmes," said he, "because I perceive that plainness is the only course left to me. The collapse of this prosecution would be the end of my hopes for the bench. I have given 30 years to this profession in expectation of that honour, and I do not scruple to say that I have enemies who would be glad to see me humbled. You suspect one of them of contriving this substitution. I suspect everyone and no one. I will tell you this also, though it does me no credit. Questions had already been raised before the trial opened as to whether the original search of Vane's rooms had been conducted with strict regard to the law. If the case now shown to be false were proved so beyond doubt, those questions would multiply, and my own conduct of the prosecution would not escape them. Holmes thanked him with a courtesy that gave no hint of what he made of this confession, and we proceeded thence to the offices of Arthur Bell, whom we found in a mood considerably more composed than his client's advocate. "I will not pretend to you, Mr. Holmes, that my past is without shadow," said Bell, leaning back in his chair with the easy candour of a man who has decided that concealment serves him worse than admission. "Some years ago, I acted for certain parties whose dealings touched upon the smuggling of goods along the eastern coast, and I do not doubt that among their number were men with connections to the sale of naval secrets. But I put it to you plainly, what bearing can my past clients have upon my present defence of Edmund Vane, a man I did not know until this case brought us together?" "None whatever, perhaps," said Holmes, "unless the two matters should prove, upon closer examination, to share a common root." He had, as he spoke, taken up the false cigarette case which Bell had asked to examine again upon some pretext of his own, and I observed, though Bell, absorbed in his argument, did not, that the solicitor's eyes rested for the barest instant upon the filed depression beneath the engraved monogram, with a flicker of recognition as swiftly suppressed as it had appeared. From Bell's chambers we went to the modest rooms of old Pritchard, who had been permitted, pending trial, to remain under a species of house arrest rather than the full rigour of the jail, his years of service having earned him that much consideration. He was a stooped, white-haired man, and his voice shook as he protested his innocence for what I gathered was not the first time that week. "The sealing-wax, sir, is mine own. I'll not deny it. I've collected such oddments from old court documents these 20 years and more, a foolish habit, but harmless as I thought. And the green thread, well, sir, we all of us wear the same green cloth. 100 threads of it might be found in every corner of that building, caught on every splinter and hinge from the robing room to the cellars." He wrung his hands. "But the label, Mr. Holmes, I never touched it. I swear it upon my mother's grave." Holmes questioned him closely upon his movements during the weeks preceding the trial, and upon his acquaintance with Pell, whom Pritchard described as a decent, quiet fellow, always ready to do a turn for an old man whose knees were no longer equal to the courthouse stairs. It was Pell himself who occupied the greater part of our afternoon. We found him at his desk in the evidence room, his ledgers arrayed before him with the same scrupulous neatness I had remarked upon our first visit, and he answered every question Holmes put to him with a promptness that seemed born less of evasion than of genuine and total recall. He produced, unasked, a complete record of every transfer touching Exhibit 17, each entry timed and initialed, and I confess that I found myself, as before, inclining toward the good opinion the man's manner so naturally invited. "I claim no credit beyond the performance of my duty, gentlemen," said he, with a modesty that seemed entirely unaffected. "The integrity of the court's records is the whole of my ambition." It was near the close of this interview that Holmes asked him, with every appearance of idle courtesy, where he had passed his boyhood. "In Leeds, Mr. Holmes, raised by an uncle who followed the trade of bookbinding, a hard man, but an honest one, who taught me the value of order in all things, which is perhaps why I have found my present calling so congenial." Holmes thanked him, and we took our leave shortly after, walking some distance through the gathering dusk before either of us spoke. "I confess, Holmes," said I at last, "that of all the persons we have seen today, Pell strikes me as the least deserving of suspicion. His records are perfect, his manner without guile, his very origins innocent of anything worse than a strict apprenticeship." "You're not alone in that impression, Watson. It is the impression the man has cultivated with as much care as he cultivates his ledgers." Holmes drew his coat closer against the evening chill, I have already sent a wire to a correspondent in Leeds who may know something of the trade directories of that city. It would not be the first time that a false history has been offered to a credulous world with more confidence than truth. Yet I would caution you against too swift a conclusion. A lie about one's uncle does not of itself prove a hand in the substitution of Crown evidence. We must have more than smoke, my friend, before we may safely say we have found the fire. Chapter 6. A Reconstruction Without a Theft. It was 2 evenings later that Holmes proposed we return once more to the evidence room, this time after the last clerk had gone and the great building lay silent save for the footsteps of a solitary watchman. Harcourt met us at a side entrance, having procured, through some ingenuity of his own, both a key and the goodwill of the night superintendent, who by now regarded our comings and goings with the weary resignation of a man who has ceased to expect explanation. "I want you to do something for me, Mr. Harcourt," said Holmes, once we stood within the narrow chamber, its cabinets rising about us like the pews of some strange chapel. "I want you to play the part of Inspector Lestrade upon the day the cigarette case was first delivered into this room. You shall bring me a parcel, any parcel will serve, and you shall hand it to Mr. Pell exactly as it was handed then, so far as your inquiries have allowed you to reconstruct the scene." Harcourt, though plainly puzzled, complied, and for the better part of an hour Holmes had him repeat the small ceremony of registration, the unwrapping of the parcel, the entry of its contents in the ledger, the affixing of a label, the placing of the object in its numbered compartment, and the sealing of the cabinet, again and again, varying some small circumstance each time, until I confess my patience, never so inexhaustible as my friend's, had begun to wear thin. "You perceive, Watson," said he at last, straightening from his examination of the ledger, "that the seals we have so admired protect the cabinet a good deal more faithfully than they protect the identity of what is placed within it. A seal can testify that a box has not been opened. It cannot testify to what the box contained before it was closed. If a false object were to be registered as Exhibit 17 from the very first hour of its arrival, no subsequent seal, however unbroken, could ever disclose the deception." "But Lestrade delivered the case himself," I objected. "Surely he would know his own evidence." "Would he? Let us inquire." And here Holmes turned to the ledger's record of that first delivery, comparing it minutely against the testimony Harcourt had gathered from Lestrade's own notebook. After some search he discovered what he sought, an entry recording that the inspector, upon bringing the case to this room, had been asked by Pell to step into the adjoining office to sign a corrected receipt, there having been some clerical confusion over an earlier exhibit. The two documents, read together, showed that the parcel containing the case had remained unattended upon the clerk's desk for a period of some 4 minutes. 4 minutes, said Holmes softly, is not long, but it is long enough for a man practised in the substitution of small objects and possessed of a duplicate already prepared to exchange the one for the other with no witness but the gas lamp above his desk. I confess a chill passed over me at this, for it seemed to point with terrible directness toward the very man whose helpfulness had so impressed us both. Yet Holmes, characteristically, would not rest upon a single inference, but turned next to the candle grease and the green thread which had first drawn his notice. "The grease," said he, kneeling once more beside the cabinet, "I find upon closer examination to be considerably older than the substitution we are investigating. Some months old, I should judge by the degree to which it has hardened and darkened, and quite unconnected with our present business. As for the thread, Harcourt's own inquiries have discovered that Pritchard knelt upon this very spot some weeks before the trial to recover a fallen document, and it is a simple matter for a thread to catch upon a hinge and remain there, undisturbed, until some later hand should point to it as evidence of recent intrusion. Both clues, you will observe, were genuine in themselves, and both were false in the conclusion they were made to support, which is, I think, the very cleverest sort of falsehood, for it requires no invention at all, only the patient arrangement of what already exists. We left the Old Bailey as the first grey light of morning touched the fog, and Holmes, rather than seeking his bed, proposed that we proceed at once to Clerkenwell, where, he informed me, a certain silversmith of his acquaintance kept early hours. The man, a small, spectacled craftsman named Ellery, received us amid the smell of hot metal and rouge, and answered Holmes's questions with the ready memory of one who took pride in his work. A cigarette case, sir, made from a wax impression rather than the article itself. Yes, I recall it well, for it is not a common commission. The gentleman gave the name of Bell, and wore gloves throughout our interview, and a dark beard, and spectacles tinted against the light, though it was a grey day and no sun to trouble him. I thought it odd at the time, but a craftsman does not question a paying customer's vanity. Can you describe his bearing, his manner of standing, of moving? He carried a stick, sir, and leaned upon it somewhat, as a man does whose leg pains him. At this description, delivered with the artless precision of a man reporting only what he had seen, I felt the case swing decisively in my own mind toward Arthur Bell. His gloves, his history among smugglers, his evident recognition of the filed monogram, all rising together into a coherent and damning pattern. I said as much to Holmes as we stood once more in the street. "It is a very natural conclusion," said he, "and I do not doubt that Lestrade, when he hears of it, will draw the very same. But tell me, Watson," and here he turned back to the shop door through which the silversmith could still be seen setting his tools in order for the day's work. "One moment more, Mr. Ellery, if you please. In which hand did your customer carry his cane?" The little man considered. "In the right hand, sir, now that you ask me to think of it particularly." A curious smile crossed my friend's face at this answer. Not the smile of a man satisfied, but of one who has caught, in some small and unexpected corner, the first true thread of a pattern he had long suspected lay concealed beneath the more obvious weave. He said nothing further upon the subject the whole length of our journey home, though I observed him turn the matter over in his mind with an intentness that boded ill, I felt certain, for someone. Chapter 7. The Case Against Arthur Bell. The blow fell upon Arthur Bell with a swiftness that left him, I think, genuinely astonished. Lestrade, acting upon the silversmith's description, and a warrant obtained within the day, descended upon the solicitor's chambers, and there discovered, in a locked drawer of his private desk, a quantity of naval blue modelling pigment, a false beard of dark hair carefully preserved in a japanned box, and a receipt from the Clerkenwell silversmith bearing the name of Bell in a hand the solicitor did not trouble to deny as his own. "I commissioned the case," said Bell when Holmes and I attended his examination at the police station that same evening, "but I did so for no criminal purpose. I received, some weeks before the trial opened, an anonymous letter warning me that the Crown's exhibit was itself a fabrication, and urging me, if I doubted the genuineness of the case shown against my client, to procure a duplicate of my own devising and compare the two." "And the disguise?" asked Lestrade with the flat scepticism of a man who's heard a great many ingenious explanations in his time. "Vanity, Inspector, nothing more. I did not care to have it known among my professional acquaintance that I'd gone skulking about Clerkenwell like a character from a penny romance. I intended only to hold the true and the false side by side before this court, and expose whatever trickery lay beneath the prosecution's case. This explanation, delivered with every appearance of sincerity, convinced no one present save, perhaps, myself, and even my own conviction wavered before the weight of circumstance now arrayed against him. Sir Matthew Corvin, informed of the discovery, declared with something of his old vigour that the matter was now plain beyond dispute. Bell had fashioned the duplicate, arranged its substitution through some confederate within the court, and had very nearly succeeded in destroying a prosecution he could not defeat by honest means. To this was added within a few hours more the intelligence, procured I gathered through the same hotel servant who had first come forward, that Bell had himself been seen in private conference with Miss Eleanor Vane, upon 2 occasions distinct from those already reported, a circumstance which seemed, to Lestrade's evident satisfaction, to knit solicitor, sister, and usher into a single conspiracy of solicitude for the prisoner. I will confess that I found the case, viewed as a whole, very nearly overwhelming. Here was a man with the means to fashion a counterfeit, a plausible motive in the protection of his client and the concealment of his own disreputable history, a disguise adopted for purposes he could not satisfactorily explain, and a secret understanding with the very woman whose devotion to her brother gave her the strongest interest in the outcome. Even Holmes, when I pressed him upon our way home that evening, acknowledged that the accumulation of fact told heavily against the solicitor. "Every circumstance points to Bell," said he, staring into the fire with an expression I had learned to associate with difficulties not yet resolved. "And it is precisely that unanimity which troubles me, Watson. I have observed, in the course of a good many years, that guilt seldom announces itself with quite so complete a chorus of agreement. The truly guilty man leaves gaps in his story, inconsistencies that betray the seams of invention. Bell's account, foolish as it sounds, has about it the ragged, unpolished quality of the truth. It was upon the following morning, as we sat over a late breakfast, that I happened to remark in the most casual manner imaginable upon a detail I had noticed while glancing through the papers seized from Bell's chambers, which Lestrade had, in a moment of unwonted generosity, permitted Holmes to examine at his leisure. "I observe," said I, buttering a slice of toast without particular thought, "that the receipt from the Clerkenwell silversmith is dated some 3 days after the register shows Exhibit 17 to have first been entered at the Old Bailey. It seems a small thing, but the date struck me as oddly out of step." Holmes set down his coffee with such abruptness that a portion of it spilled upon the cloth, wholly disregarded. "Watson," said he, in a voice from which every trace of languor had vanished, "you have this instant done what 3 days of my own investigation had failed to accomplish. Read that again, if you please, and read it slowly." I did so, though I confess I did not at first perceive the significance he attached to it. "The receipt is dated the 14th. The register shows the case entered upon the 11th. Then consider what that signifies. The false case now shown in court had already been placed within the evidence system 3 full days before Arthur Bell ever set foot in Ellery's shop. It is not merely a weakness in the theory against him, Watson. It destroys that theory root and branch. A man cannot substitute an object with a duplicate he has not yet caused to be made." "But the disguise, the pigment, surely these are not without meaning?" "They are without the meaning Lestrade has given them," said Holmes, rising and beginning to pace before the fire with the swift, restless stride I had come to recognise as the outward sign of an inward illumination. "Someone, Watson, has taken very great pains to see that Bell's materials should be discovered precisely where the police would be certain to find them, relying upon the natural and very human tendency to confuse 2 duplicate cases where in truth there exist 3 objects altogether: the genuine case, still concealed somewhere beyond our reach, the false case now resting in the Crown's cabinet, registered there before Bell had so much as conceived his scheme, and Bell's own harmless duplicate, made in good faith and for an innocent purpose, which someone has contrived to make appear the instrument of a crime it could not possibly have committed." He turned to me with an energy I had not seen in him since the affair began. "We have been asking the wrong question from the first, my friend. We have asked ourselves who might have stolen the tracing paper from a genuine exhibit. We ought to have asked, from the very outset, whether the exhibit was ever genuine at all." Chapter 8. The number written twice. Holmes spent the better part of that day and the whole of the following night closeted with the court ledger, which Harcourt had obtained upon some pretext or other, and conveyed to Baker Street beneath his coat with the furtive air of a man smuggling contraband. I do not think my friend left his chair above twice in all those hours, save to replenish his supply of strong tobacco, and when at last he summoned me to his side, his eyes had the hollow, burning look of a man who has driven himself to the very limit of endurance in pursuit of a single fact. "Come and look at this, Watson," said he, "and tell me what you make of it." I bent above the page he indicated, upon which was inscribed, in a small and careful hand, the entry recording the registration of Exhibit 17. To my eye, it appeared no different from 100 other entries upon the same page, save that Holmes had ringed the numeral with a fine pencil line. "I see nothing remarkable," I confessed, "beyond the neatness of the hand." "Examine the ink," said he, passing me his lens. "You will observe that the figure 1 is inscribed in a deep blue-black ink of a character that dries to a slight sheen, and possesses, if you hold the page to the light, a faint metallic lustre, the unmistakable signature of iron gall ink, such as Pell himself informed us is invariably used for these labels. But the figure 7 beside it is of a duller, flatter black, without that lustre, and bleeds very slightly into the fibre of the paper in a manner iron gall ink does not. It is copying ink, Watson, of the sort used for duplicate registers, and it has been added, unless I am very much mistaken, at a date considerably later than the first figure beside it." "You mean that the exhibit was first entered as Exhibit 1? "I mean precisely that. The original package delivered by Lestrade upon that first morning was registered under a provisional number, as is not uncommon when a case is newly brought, and its place upon the Crown's list not yet determined. It was Pell himself, by his own account, who later reorganised the prosecution's evidence and assigned to each article its final number, and it was in the course of that reorganisation, I now believe, that the figure 7 was added to what had first stood as a solitary one." He turned then to a second and more delicate operation, holding the ledger's succeeding page to the lamp at a low and raking angle, so that the surface rather than the ink caught the light. "Pressure marks, Watson. The faint impression left upon an underpage by the pen of a hand writing upon the page above. Look here, beneath the official entry for Exhibit 17, and tell me what you can discern." I peered as he directed, and made out with some difficulty a ghostly trace of characters pressed into the paper's grain, spelling out, so far as I could judge, the words "silver case," initials J. P. "JP," said I slowly. "But the case belongs to Vane. His initials are EV, are they not?" "They are the initials engraved upon it now," said Holmes, and there was in his voice a note I had seldom heard there before, grave and a little sorrowful, as though the triumph of discovery brought him no pleasure to match its intellectual satisfaction. "The filed depression we noted beneath the present monogram, Watson, the one over which I observed Arthur Bell's eye linger with such curious recognition, did not once bear the initials of Edmund Vane at all. It bore, I am now persuaded, the initials of Josiah Pell." I confess that for some moments I could not frame a reply, so entirely did this revelation overturn the estimate I had formed, along with every other person concerned in the case, of that mild and helpful clerk. Holmes, meanwhile, had drawn from his pocket the small envelope in which he had preserved since our second visit to Clerkenwell a further observation obtained from the silversmith, namely that his mysterious customer, though he carried his cane in the right hand, had used the left to turn and examine the case beneath the workshop lamp, holding it with the peculiar deftness of a man more accustomed to his left hand for delicate work than his right. "You will recall," said Holmes, "that I asked Ellery in which hand his customer bore his stick. The right, he told me, which is to say, the same hand a man burdened with a limp, real or feigned, would naturally employ. But it was the left hand that examined the silver, and did so, Ellery observed without my prompting, with a neatness that spoke of long practice. I have since had occasion to watch Josiah Pell mend a torn page in that very ledger before us, Watson, and I saw him hold the needle and thread in his left hand throughout, though he writes, as we have both observed, with his right. Then the man who commissioned the false beard and gloves at Clerkenwell was not Arthur Bell, wearing a disguise to conceal his own features, but a man of quite different habit, disguising himself as best he could to resemble, in the vaguest particulars, a solicitor he had never troubled to study closely, relying upon gloves and beard and tinted glass to defeat a memory he could not otherwise deceive. There remained but one thread more, and Holmes drew it forth with the same quiet thoroughness he had brought to all the rest. The blue pigment discovered beneath the screw of the false case which had seemed at first to point towards some connection with naval charts, he now traced, through a sample procured under pretence of clerical business, to the coloured transfer paper kept in ordinary use within Pell's own evidence office, a material employed for nothing more sinister than the marking of duplicate ledger entries, but capable, in careless or deliberate hands, of leaving upon a screw head the very stain that had so misled us toward the Admiralty and its secrets. "He had access to everything, Watson," said Holmes at last, laying down his lens with the air of a man who has completed a long and wearisome labour. The case itself, from the 4 unwatched minutes in which it first came to him, the labels, the ledgers, the registry of every article that passed beneath his hand. And through his quiet, ingratiating helpfulness, access likewise to the confidence of every person in this affair whose possessions or whose history might be turned, with sufficient patience, into evidence against another. He crossed to the desk and drew out a telegraph form, upon which he wrote rapidly for some moments. "I am asking Lestrade to gather every person concerned in this matter here, in our own sitting room, tomorrow evening. It is time, I think, that Mr. Josiah Pell answered for the trust so many have been persuaded to place in him." Chapter 9. The Identity of Josiah Pell. Our sitting room at Baker Street, spacious as I had always accounted it, seemed scarcely equal to the gathering that assembled there upon the following evening. Sir Matthew Corvin arrived first, grave and watchful. Arthur Bell came shortly after, still bearing something of the wounded dignity of a man lately and unjustly suspected. Miss Eleanor Vane, pale but composed, took the chair nearest the fire. Old Pritchard, released upon Lestrade's authority pending the outcome of the evening, sat twisting his hat between his hands, and Lestrade himself stood near the door with the particular stiffness of a man who has been told to expect a revelation he cannot yet credit. Last of all came Josiah Pell, mild and unremarkable as ever, glancing about the room with an expression of polite bewilderment entirely suited to a man who supposes himself present only to assist in the unmasking of some other criminal. Holmes stood before the fireplace, and when he began to speak, it was in that low, even voice he reserved for the gravest of his narrations. "I must ask your patience," said he, "while I lay before you the true history of Crown Exhibit 17, a history very different from that which has been believed by every person in this room until this hour. Edmund Vane, gentlemen, made a discovery some months ago which cost him dear. He learned, through channels connected with his work at the Admiralty, that confidential naval plans were being sold abroad through a network of intermediaries operating with considerable cunning and greater patience. He did not know, and none of us knew until 3 days since, that the true organizer of that network was not to be found among the smugglers of the eastern coast, nor among the disreputable clients of an ambitious solicitor, but within the very courts of justice charged with prosecuting the theft." A murmur ran through the room, and I saw Pell's mild countenance stiffen very slightly, though he said nothing. "The man before you, known to this court as Josiah Pell, evidence clerk of quiet and unblemished reputation, is in fact James Parlow, formerly a copying clerk in the service of the Admiralty itself, dismissed some years since for the falsification of records, a fact he has taken considerable pains to bury beneath a new name and a fictitious history of a Leeds bookbinder uncle, who exists, I regret to inform the company, in no trade directory of that city, nor in the memory of any person now living there." "This is monstrous," said Pell, or Parlow as I must now call him, his voice for the first time sharp with something other than mildness. "I have served this court faithfully for precisely as long as your position permitted you to learn which stolen materials had been recovered by the police, and which suspects remained under investigation," said Holmes, without raising his own voice in the least. A position of remarkable convenience for a man engaged in the very traffic that position was meant to guard against. He turned to the company at large. When Inspector Lestrade delivered the genuine cigarette case to the evidence room, Parlow understood at once the danger it represented, for the tracing paper concealed within its lining threatened to expose the very network he had spent years constructing. He required but 4 unwatched minutes, gentlemen, 4 minutes secured by the simple expedient of inventing a clerical error and requesting the inspector's signature upon a corrected receipt in an adjoining office, to remove the true case and substitute another older case of his own, from which he had already filed away his own initials to make room for a monogram he engraved to resemble veins. The velvet lining was replaced, the false object registered under a provisional number and in due course reassigned, through his own authority over the reorganization of exhibits, to the number that would place it beyond ordinary suspicion. "But the true case," said Sir Matthew, finding his voice at last. "What became of it?" He dared not destroy it at once for a very human reason. Mr. Bell had already begun, through channels of his own, to raise questions that suggested the Crown's evidence might not withstand close examination. Parlow could not know how much Bell had guessed, and so he took the surer course. He encouraged, through an anonymous letter, the very inquiry he most feared, trusting that Bell's honest curiosity would furnish him with a second duplicate case, disguised materials, and a receipt that could later be discovered exactly where the police would be certain to look, thereby directing suspicion toward a man whose history among smugglers made him, upon the surface, so plausible a villain. "And Pritchard's sealing wax," began Lestrade, "was planted in his lodgings by the same patient hand, along with a torn label whose fibres, you will recall, were disturbed from the printed rather than the blank side, the mark of a man who tore the paper with deliberate care to preserve the appearance of concealment, rather than in the genuine haste of a thief. The green thread upon the cabinet hinge, genuine in itself, was left to point toward Pritchard's uniform. The meetings between Pritchard and Miss Vane, innocent exchanges concerning a letter to her imprisoned brother, were permitted to appear as evidence of a conspiracy neither party had ever formed." He paused, and regarded Parlow with an expression in which I read something very near to sorrow. "Every false theory this affair has produced, gentlemen, rested upon a single unexamined assumption, that Crown Exhibit 17 was a genuine article when first it entered that cabinet. Once that assumption is set aside, the locked doors, the 3 keys, and the unbroken seals become no more than an elaborate frame around an empty picture." Holmes crossed to a cupboard and produced, wrapped in plain paper, the true cigarette case, its diagonal scratch plainly visible across the monogram. "Recovered, gentlemen, from a hollow compartment beneath the false bottom of Mr. Parlow's own evidence desk, where the tracing paper yet remains, together with correspondence sufficient, I think, to satisfy the authorities upon every point of this network's extent." Parlow's composure broke at last. He started for the door with a suddenness that caught every man in the room save one unprepared. But Lestrade, who had stationed himself there from the first, with an instinct I had not credited him, seized his arm before he had crossed the threshold, and the quiet clerk who had deceived a court of law was led away at last in the plain iron grip of the law he had so long and so cleverly betrayed. Chapter 10. The Honour of the Crown. The weeks that followed brought a swift and welcome unwinding of the injustice that had so nearly closed about 3 innocent persons. The charges against old Pritchard were withdrawn within a matter of days, and I had the pleasure of seeing the old usher restored to his post at the Old Bailey, where, I am told, he goes about his duties with a gravity even greater than before, as though 30 years of unblemished service had been tested in the fire, and had emerged, if anything, the more precious for the trial. Arthur Bell's name was likewise cleared, and I confess that whatever reservations I had once held concerning his professional polish were considerably softened by the dignity with which he bore an ordeal not of his making. Edmund Vane was released from custody amid a swell of public sympathy, as sudden and as fervent as the suspicion that had lately condemned him, and he did not, I am glad to record, content himself with mere gratitude. In the months that followed, he placed his knowledge of the Admiralty's affairs at the service of the authorities, and was instrumental, so Holmes gave me to understand, in the identification of several other members of the espionage network that Parlow, I shall not trouble the reader with his false name again, had spent so many patient years assembling. Sir Matthew Corvan, to his credit, did not seek to minimise the debt he owed to the anxious young barrister whose insistence upon a vanished dent had first set the whole inquiry in motion. He acknowledged, before his colleagues at the bar and I believe before the Lord Chief Justice himself, that Harcourt's observation had prevented what might otherwise have stood as one of the gravest miscarriages of justice in the modern history of the court. Harcourt's career, so lately endangered by an insistence his elders had dismissed as fanciful, was strengthened rather than diminished by the affair, and I understand he has since been marked out for advancement considerably beyond the ordinary course of a junior counsel's expectations. For Parlow himself there remained only the reckoning of the law. He was convicted, in a trial held largely in camera on account of the sensitive nature of the evidence, upon charges of espionage, obstruction of justice, and the falsification of court records, and I am told that even the judge who pronounced sentence upon him remarked, with some bitterness, that a man who had spent 30 years demonstrating the value of trustworthy service had done more, in the space of a single betrayal, to unsettle the public's confidence in the machinery of justice than a dozen ordinary criminals might have accomplished by open violence. It was some evenings after the trial's conclusion, as Holmes and I sat before our own fire with the case at last concluded and the papers cleared from the table, that I found myself returning to a question that had troubled me since the night of Parlow's unmasking. "Holmes," said I, "there is one point in this affair I have not yet heard you explain. Why did the man retain the genuine cigarette case at all? Surely its destruction, so simple a matter, would have removed the one object capable of proving his guilt beyond dispute. Instead he kept it, concealed but intact, within reach of the very desk from which his deception was conducted." Holmes considered the question for some moments before replying, his pipe glowing faintly in the dim light. "It is a curious feature of such men, Watson, and one I have observed before in cases of a similar character, that they become, in time, the servants of their own methods rather than the masters of them. Parlow's whole career, both before his disgrace at the Admiralty and after it in his assumed identity, was built upon the meticulous keeping of records, a compulsion, I might almost call it, to possess and control every document that touched upon his affairs. To destroy the true case would have been, for such a man, an act of self-denial almost physically repugnant to him. He could not bear to relinquish control of the one object that held, within its silver walls, the whole history of his deception. He preserved it, I believe, not from carelessness, but from the same instinct that led him to falsify a ledger rather than leave a blank page. He wished to command even the evidence of his own guilt, as though its safekeeping were somehow a continuation of the very authority he had built his false life upon. I turned this answer over in my mind and found in it, as I so often did in Holmes's explanations, something that illuminated not merely the particulars of the case before us, but some darker corner of human nature generally. "It is a melancholy thought," said I, "that so much patience and skill, employed toward decent ends, might have made of Parlow a valuable servant of the very court he chose, instead to betray. It is the melancholy thought that underlies half the criminal history I have had occasion to study," said Holmes. "But I would have you consider, Watson, before you set down this affair in whatever pages you intend for it, the true moral it offers, not the ruin of a clever man, which is common enough, but the danger of a system, however solemn its procedures, that mistakes the appearance of order for the substance of truth. The locks, the seals, the ledgers, the 3 keys held by 3 trustworthy men, all of it inspired a confidence that proved, in the event, to be entirely misplaced, for not one of those safeguards was designed to test the honesty of the man who stood, quite unremarked, at the very centre of the system meant to guard against him. He knocked the ash from his pipe and regarded the dying fire with an expression I had come, over years of friendship, to recognise as something close to contentment, the quiet satisfaction of a mind that has restored order where confusion threatened to prevail. "The mystery was solved in the end," said he, "not because any lock was picked nor any seal broken, but because one anxious young man noticed not what appeared before him, but what had vanished from it. a single shallow scratch upon a piece of silver, no larger than the width of a knife's edge, and yet sufficient in a world that trusts too readily to appearances to unravel the whole fabric of a very patient lie. And so, gentle reader, ends the singular affair of Crown Exhibit 17, a case which taught me, not for the first time in my long association with Sherlock Holmes, that the most dangerous deceptions are seldom those wrapped in mystery, but those clothed with quiet and patient artistry in the unremarkable garments of trust.